Hi everybody, I'm Avery, and today we're talking about World War I. So, as Americans living nearly a century after the close of the First World War, our perception of this moment in history is a little murky. It's mainly informed by the media that we consume. Media that features scenes of young heroes with guns, shells running past their head while they're trying to avoid an unseemly fate. But this media very rarely portrays the battles after the war. My thesis explores this gap and specifically investigates the relationship between the diagnosis of shell shock and gender. So, what does this mean? Part 1, historical context. In British society was inundated with ideology that war was something enjoyable. Young men were given stories of courage, heroism, and sacrifice growing up, leading them to feel excited for the day that they would be able to be a soldier and bring glory to the empire. As a result, these young men were looking forward to signing up for war, believing that they would be in for the adventure of a lifetime. This was obviously not the case. During the war, men experienced symptoms of what we now know as PTSD, then known as shell shock. These included depression, anxiety, mania, emotional numbness, and a slew of physical symptoms that rendered them completely powerless. This was confusing to the political and military empires that situated them in this position. However, shell shock was so prevalent that by 1916 it accounted for 40% of the casualties in fighting zones. This is very significant, and it rendered British society completely on its head. Now, instead of recognizing shell shock as a crisis of mental health, it was recognized as a crisis of cowardice. And it was dealt with in the only way that they knew how to take care of cowardice, which was by execution. This was a direct target to silence the exhibitions of trauma by soldiers and resulted in a crisis of masculinity for British society. Part 2, madness and masculinity. So, in order to understand the mental health crisis that was shell shock, we first have to understand the mental health crisis that is the hysteria of Victorian women. In the mid to late 1800s, women during this time period, primarily middle to upper class women, experienced symptoms of emotional numbness, mania, depression, anxiety, and a slew of other physical symptoms that rendered them completely powerless. Sound familiar? Oops.
Sorry, I went crazy.
No, you're good. These women were given two options: tranquilizers or emotional suppression, or the rest cure, i.e. being taken away to an idyllic location, away from their husband, their family, and away from British society to view the symptoms that they were experiencing. Shell shock was treated similarly. In fact, initially diagnosis of shell shock was in fact hysteria, and the name was changed only when the disease became so unignorable that the medical institution wanted to separate any associations with a woman's disease. Shell shock emerged as a direct counterpart to hysteria, despite the symptoms being almost exact. So, I've analyzed two texts in my thesis that represent this idea, the first of which is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Mrs. Dalloway is a novel written in 1925 by Virginia Woolf, and it follows a woman as she buys some flowers, holds a dinner party, and catches up with an old friend. Sounds kind of boring, right? Wrong. The stream of consciousness writing style in this novel allows the reader to understand the thoughts, motivations, and actions of every single character that it interacts with. Through this, we are able to see the disconnect between a British culture after the war whose internal motivations and desires are directly disconnect from their outward performance as people. We can see this primarily through two characters, the first of which is Septimus Smith, a soldier suffering from shell shock. Now, Septimus has come back from the war, he is fine, but he is deeply traumatized. Everyone can see his suffering, and yet it is completely ignored. Septimus's wife is in fact discontent with his behavior, and over the course of the novel he sees two doctors who are working to fix his ailments. The first of which is Dr. Holmes, who is described as someone who is menacing, out to get Septimus. He's described as a figure of a monster, and yet the only thing that he does to Septimus is tell him, "You're fine. You just need to get a drink with some friends. You're fine. You don't have any disease whatsoever." This dismissal is one of the most prominent ways that soldiers experiencing shell shock were treated following the war. The other of which, represented by a character named Dr. William Bradshaw, sentences Septimus to exactly the same treatment that Victorian women experienced when they were diagnosed with hysteria, that being the rest cure. Septimus is prescribed a long rest in bed, a delightful home down in the country, away from his wife, away from his family, and away from the gaze of British society that doesn't know what to do with his disease. Moving on. The second character we can see this disconnect between internal and external in is Clarissa Dalloway. Now, Clarissa kind of does nothing throughout most of the novel. Most of her character is an internal monologue, and through her, we can see the disassociation and the malaise of the modern 20th century woman. Clarissa's central character conflict stems from the fact that she feels as though she is invisible. She has no identity. She is described as unseen, unknown, being there no more marrying, no more having of children now, but only the astonishing and rather solemn progress with the rest of them. This being Mrs. Dalloway, not even Clarissa anymore, but Mrs. Richard Dalloway. Clarissa ruminates constantly of her years as a young girl and the different flings that she had, one of which was with her friend Sally, a woman, and the other of which was with her near fiancé, Peter. Clarissa's youth represents a time where she is not confined by the social expectations of being a wife and being a mother. And yet, fulfilling those social expectations is what has made her miserable. Through Clarissa and Septimus, we can see that the gendered expectations of the larger social order do not serve either party, and in fact contribute to the mental illness that both of these characters experience. Clarissa, having fulfilled her duties as a wife and a mother, is rendered obsolete and experiences a disassociation and a depression that she cannot figure out why she's experiencing. Septimus has fulfilled his gendered obligation to be a soldier and fight in a war. He has returned unharmed, he is brave, and yet he is unable to reconcile with his experiences that he had on the front. This shows that the field of psychiatry and medicine was not in fact working to counteract actual diseases in its patients. It was working to uphold a social order that was created with a gendered expectation that doesn't serve either party. Now, this is continued explicitly in the novel Regeneration, written by Pat Barker. This is a work of historical fiction written in 1990 that utilizes real individuals as characters, the most prominent of which are Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Robert Graves. All three of these men were trench poets, or as we know now, poets who wrote while they were fighting. And two of them, Wilfred and Siegfried, did a real stay in a real war hospital called Craig Lockhart and were treated by a real doctor named W.H.R. Rivers. All of these things are characters in this book. Now, W.H.R. Rivers is a sympathetic man. He is the father of talk therapy, and he is one of the first people to prove its merits in psychology in the early 20th century. And he is notable for the innovation that expressing problems and confronting them directly has a direct positive correlation in patients experiencing trauma. However, in the novel, his central conflict revolves around the fact that his innovative methods of therapeutic practice help his soldiers, and yet the help that he gives them directly sends them back to the front. Rivers is foiled by an evil doctor, not actually, but his name is Dr. Yeeland, and he uses experimental psychiatric methods such as shock therapy and experimental surgery, lobotomy, to violently render soldiers experiencing shell shock back into tip-top shape. The goal, like Rivers, is just to get them well enough to go back to the front. Yet the outcome is the same. They're fine enough to fight, yet if they were to come back, they would experience continuous horrors regardless. So, why is this significant? Because either way, regardless of whether the therapeutic practice was positive or negative, both doctors were silencing their patients. The only difference is that Yeeland feels no remorse for the actions that he's taking, whereas Rivers absolutely does. In fact, he describes that he feels nightmarish in his act of silencing his patients. This novel proves that the medical establishment, although it's meant to help soldiers during the time, was only in fact helping them enough to get them back to the front to go die for the empire. Now, why am I talking about any of this? What I think is significant about this time period, these novels, and this idea is how it proves that larger social systems create solutions to problems only when it benefits them. This is a small example in World War I, and yet we can see how the expectations of gender and strict binaries and behaviors that ascribe to those binaries are still harmful and still only are helpful to others when they're serving like the larger political institution. We live in an increasingly divided society. This is no secret. And we can see how gender is becoming one of the biggest fuels for this divide. Obviously, we can see during the World War I time period how trusted institutions such as medicine were given the opportunity to create an actual aid for individuals experiencing hardship and only perpetuated the goals of the larger state. We can see this today. I feel like young people, for us, our trusted institution is the media. We can see how these strict ideas of what masculinity and femininity look like have infiltrated our spaces, and whether or not you think that, whatever, how it's contributing to a larger goal that may or may not help or hurt real people struggling with real things. We can be done.
No, sorry.
We can.
Really, no. Keep going.
I don't have a dramatic closing statement. Ultimately, my interest in this subject and in these books has a lot to do with the parallel that I noticed when I became fascinated with World War I between the way that women are mistreated by the medical system today, have been for hundreds of years, and the way that these soldiers were ultimately mistreated by people that were meant to help them. I think ultimately the moral of this story is that not necessarily gendered expectations harm people, but any expectation that confines people and defines people based on a set of behaviors and a set of attributes that largely people have fluidity to explore within and also to a certain extent no control over is harmful either way. And I think there's a really notable parallel between the crisis of masculinity, this fear that men were becoming feminine because they were expressing emotion following the war, they were expressing their trauma in a way that they knew how to, which was just expressing it. And with the parallel that we see today, where I think social pillars that have upheld society for so long started to crumble a bit, and we started to recognize how unnecessary certain facets of humanity have become, and that has caused another crisis, and we're seeing very extreme reactions as a result. And that's really all I have to say.
Beautiful. And there's even kittens on the list.
Yes, there's some kittens. I'm a big fan of this person who very clearly, this is very clear, these two are very clearly like, oh, we found a kitten, everyone loves cats. We'll take a picture. And this person very clearly made this a thing. He got dressed and he orchestrated a portrait to be taken of him and his cat. And it tickles me because this is probably, well, this is sad, but this is probably one of the only pictures that exist of this human. And I personally would love that to be my legacy if the only picture of me that existed 200 years in the future was me with my cat looking awesome. So yeah. Also, they were people, so.
Thank you so much, Aivry. And now, that was fantastic. You did great. I open it up to you all for questions or comments from Aivry. And I see one right there.
Do you believe that fiction writers have the capacity to improve this situation? Or do you see, because these are amazing novels that you're referring to, and a fascinating novelist who wrote the Trad Wife book.
Amazing novelists.
But your background is not as a historian. This is through the lens of literature. So what is the role of fiction writers in this situation? Do you think they have the power to make things better, or are they really almost like reporters, just letting us know what's happening?
Yeah, amazing question. For those of you who couldn't hear clearly, Dr. Clemens asked whether or not I believe fiction writers have the power to change these kind of issues. And I absolutely do believe so. Something that I didn't mention, just because I was moving quite quickly, is that Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway was one of the first long-form works of literature to depict shell shock in that way. Most of the depictions of the disease prior to her novel was poetry. And it was loose and disconnected in a way that poetry often is. It's portraying a feeling, it's portraying an image, it's not describing in the same detail that you can kind of get with a novel. And being a woman, she had the ability to kind of observe this phenomenon as it was happening without having, the horrific experience of going through it. And for those of you who aren't aware, Virginia Woolf herself kind of suffered from what we would probably now call bipolar or BPD. She had her own mental struggles, and so she could kind of see these parallels that I'm talking about play out in real time, and she wrote a character that honestly has very little to do with the actual story. If you read the book, he's kind of out of place, and portray it with such intimate detail. And obviously the book, we're still reading it this many years later. Virginia Woolf is a phenomenon, so absolutely. And Pat Barker's Regeneration, once again, a woman who has no experience with the war. In fact, she wrote it in the 90s, very far away from the war's end. And the Regeneration is a series, and the third book won the International Booker Prize. So both of these works are very revered in the canon of contemporary English literature, but also at the same time, they're treating it from a different angle than we typically see, and that is the reason why they are so significant. So long-winded answer, but definitely fiction writers are maybe the cure, I don't know. Iman, did you have a question?
Sorry, that's right.
I'm sorry.
I was just wondering, I know you talked about the modern application in the sense of the gender roles, and I was wondering if you think there's also an association between the association of historical femininity and the current stigma that we have around mental health as a whole.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Something that I maybe didn't articulate clear enough is I do think that mental illness as a concept, as a phenomenon, is something that is primarily gendered female if we had to define it in a certain term. Just because even today there are still problems with men feeling like they can't express their emotion or else they will not be seen as masculine enough. Or the complete opposite, men who do express emotions are seen as, possibly having different sexualities than the norm, or perhaps being a woman themselves. It's still very stigmatized, and I think a huge reason just dates back to all of this, the origins of the mental health industry, because we would not have the psychiatry and the psychology we have today without shell shock. And if shell shock hadn't freaked out the political system by quote unquote making men effeminate and exhibiting what they consider to be feminine behaviors, then we would not have medication for ADHD. We would not have accessible therapy. So yeah, definitely for sure. Anybody?
Any more questions or comments? We've got time for maybe one or two more.
If we don't have any questions, I would love to shout out a picture on this PowerPoint. Can you go over 2 slides, please?
Yes.
I really want to point y'all's attention to this because it makes me laugh. So this is my favorite slide on this PowerPoint. This is my propaganda slide. This is real artwork that was given to young British men, and by young, I mean young, ages 14 to 17 perhaps was their target demographic. You can kind of tell their target demographic, you can kind of tell who their target demographic was. And the image that just makes me giggle is this lion propaganda. Don't you feel the call of the wild? Aren't you ready to enlist?
I love it.
It really tickles me. Same with this knight slaying the dragon, Dr. Sharon. I think you'll appreciate this one. Doesn't that make you want to enlist?
It needs you at once.
Yeah, the rhetorical choices in these images really make me laugh, but they also make me sad because it's a very clear, targeted attempt to appeal to a certain brain and a certain audience. And so, we know in retrospect, oh, this lion is kind of silly. Really? That's what y'all were doing? But it worked, Millions of boys between those ages died because of falling for this. So it's another lesson to be wary of rhetorical choices and to really think about what we're interacting with, going back to the Trad Wife book. Yeah, just,
I would love, well, one more hand for Aivry. To say a little bit about working with Aivry and then to stroll and board her.
Do you want the microphone?
I have something to read, so yes. Just a few words about Aivry. Do I put my glasses on? It's my great honor to bestow the stole on Aivry Zamora. I think of Aivry as the greatest English literature major that I never had, which just goes to show you her breadth of expertise and competence. This is because, scandalously, she's not actually a literature major, even though she's just completed one of the best honors projects that I can remember on the subject of English literature. She's also gone above and beyond my majors in another way, and that is to complete both of the theory courses that I offer, rhetorical theory and literary theory. A truly masochistic endeavor. After seeing her ace those theory courses, working with Aivry on this project has felt more like collaborating with a colleague than helping a student. In fact, while working on this particular project, we've given each other reading recommendations, as well as film recommendations. At one point, I agreed to watch her suggestion of Sam Mendes's film 1917, an incredible movie that I had not yet seen. You should see it if you're interested in World War I. If she would give Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory a try. So it was like having a film club within a writing club. And didn't you use a slide from
I did.
Kubrick? Yeah, I thought I noticed that. Yeah. So yes, thanks to Aivry's other mentors, such as Corey Locke and Alex Barron, I have to give a shout out to them. Aivry has always had a sense of where to go with this project and the right questions to ask. I've really just assisted her with the final stage of getting it written and polished. And I know Aivry will excel in whatever she tackles next as well. Last year, Aivry asked me to write a letter of recommendation for her, which I'm still waiting to use. Ball's in your court. In the meantime, I'll just end today by quoting from the end of that letter. Here's what I wrote. I would rank Aivry among the top 1%, if not higher, of academically talented students that I've taught here at St. Edward's University. But even beyond academics, Aivry radiates an energy that is infectious for other students. She truly embodies the best of what a liberal arts graduate can be. But don't let it go to your head.
Well, I did ask for the microphone, so I clearly didn't need one.
I give it back to you.
Cue ceremonial music.